We meet her in the worst hour of her life, 26 years old, 7 months carrying a child, and utterly alone on a wagon road that the snow had already begun to erase. Her name was Mary Ann Hale, and 3 weeks earlier she had buried her husband Thomas beneath a cottonwood outside the small Wyoming settlement of Cedar Hollow, killed when a rock slide took the trail crew he led into the high country. The bank in town, run by a hard man named Otis Pruitt, had wasted no grief before calling in the dead on Thomas's land, and so Mary Ann found herself with a single trunk, $12 sewn into her hem, and a promise from a distant cousin in Laramie that there might be a room for her, if she could only get there before the passes closed. She had not gotten there in time. Now the wind had teeth, the light was dying early and mean, and somewhere in the white, nothing ahead of her, she had lost the road entirely. What she did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that a silent man living alone on that mountain, a man the valley believed had died 7 years before, was about to walk out of the storm and refuse, for reasons of his own, to let her die in it. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Mary Ann Hale. If you are watching this from somewhere far from anyone who might come looking for you, tell us where you're from in the comments. We'd love to know we reached you. Mary Ann had grown up the daughter of a Missouri blacksmith, and from him she had learned 2 things that never left her: that a fire could be coaxed back to life from the smallest coal if you were patient with it, and that a person's worth had nothing to do with how much they carried in their pockets. Her father used to say that iron didn't care where you came from, only whether you knew how to listen to it, and Mary Ann had spent her girlhood listening, to the forge, to the wind through the shop doors, to her mother's quiet counsel, that kindness given away never truly left a person poorer. She met Thomas Hale at 19, a surveyor's son with an easy laugh and a habit of noticing things other men walked past. And when he asked her to come west with him to Wyoming territory, she had gone without a single backward glance, certain that whatever waited for them, they would meet it together. For 6 years they had built a modest life at the edge of Cedar Hollow, a town of perhaps 400 souls tucked against the foothills, where Thomas worked the trail crews cutting new routes through the mountains, and Mary Ann kept a garden that fed half the widows on their lane. She had wanted more than anything to be the kind of woman who left a place better than she found it, and in small ways, a shared harvest, a mended coat, a night spent sitting with a sick neighbor. She had done exactly that, never once imagining that the very kindness she practiced so quietly would someday be the thing that saved her life on a mountain she had never meant to cross. The fall came fast and merciless, the way winter itself seemed to that year. Thomas had gone into the high passes in early November to finish grading a supply route before the snow shut it down. And word came back to Cedar Hollow 3 days later that a slide had taken 4 men, Thomas among them, and left nothing to bury but what the mountain chose to give up. Mary Ann's grief had barely found its shape before Otis Pruitt, who held the note on their little homestead, arrived at her door with a ledger under his arm and expression that pretended at sympathy, while his eyes did the arithmetic of loss. The loan, he informed her, had been made to Thomas Hale specifically, and with no man to work the land and no family established in the territory, the bank could not in good conscience allow the debt to go unaddressed. Within a fortnight she had signed papers she barely had the strength to read, watched strangers walk through rooms that still smelled of her husband's tobacco, and boarded a hired wagon with everything she owned reduced to 1 trunk and a coin purse thin enough to fold in her palm. Her cousin's letter from Laramie, 3 months old and crease-soft from handling, was the only firm ground she had left to stand on, and so she had gone, against every neighbor's gentle warning that the passes were already treacherous and a woman in her condition had no business on that road alone. She had smiled and told them she had no choice, and she had been right, and it had very nearly killed her. The storm found her on the 2nd day out, in a stretch of country where the trail forked twice and no fork was marked. And within an hour the world had narrowed to gray wind and stinging white, and the panicked breathing of a horse that no longer trusted its own footing. She lost the road first, then lost the horse when it bolted at a crack of falling timber, and she stumbled on alone, one hand pressed to the curve of her belly, as though she might shield the child from the cold by sheer will, until her legs simply stopped answering her. It was there, half buried against a fallen spruce with the light nearly gone, that she felt herself lifted. Not by wind, but by arms, strong and sure, and utterly without hesitation, belonging to a man wrapped so thoroughly in furs and scarves against the storm that she could see nothing of his face at all, only his eyes, pale and steady, fixed on her as though she were the only thing in that whole white ruin worth saving. He did not speak. Not then, not through the long, jolting walk to a low cabin built into the mountainside so cleverly that she would not have seen it from 10 feet away. Not as he built up the fire and pressed a tin cup of something bitter and warm into her shaking hands. Marianne, half delirious with cold and fear for the child, asked him twice who he was and where they were, and both times he only inclined his head, as if to say she was safe, and let his silence answer the rest. It was 3 days before the storm broke enough for her to properly see him. A broad-shouldered man, perhaps 40 years old, dark-bearded, with a scar tracing one side of his jaw, and hands that moved with the careful economy of someone who had spent years alone and had no more words to spare than necessity required. He fed her, kept the fire fed in turn, checked on her through the night as her time drew nearer than either of them liked, and never once asked for her story, nor offered his own, until the morning she found, tucked into a shelf behind his cookware, a small tin box holding a single photograph. A much younger version of the same face, standing beside a woman and a boy of perhaps 10, and behind them, unmistakably, the church steeple of Cedar Hollow. She confronted him with it gently, for she had learned by then that gentleness was the only language he seemed to trust, and after a long silence, he took a slate and a stub of chalk from beside the hearth and wrote a single name, Elias Boone. Marianne's breath caught, for she knew that name. Every soul in Cedar Hollow knew it, in the hushed way people speak of old tragedies. 7 years before, Elias Boone had been the town's blacksmith and, by every account, one of its gentlest men, until a fire had swept through the livery he worked beside, killing 2 boys who had been sheltering from a storm inside, and though no charge was ever proven, the town's grief had needed somewhere to land, and it had landed, cruelly and permanently, on him. His wife had left with their son within the month, unable to bear the whispers, and Elias himself had vanished into the mountains not long after, presumed by most to have died out there, alone, unable to live with the guilt the town had handed him, without proof. Marianne, staring at that slate, understood all at once that the silent man who had carried her 3 miles through a blizzard was a ghost. The valley had buried in its own gossip, still very much alive, still paying for a fire he had likely never set. She wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything since Thomas died, to ask him the truth of that night, and slowly, over the following days, through slate and gesture and the occasional cracked, disused word, he told her what he could. He had smelled lamp oil that should not have been near the hayloft, had suspected a hired hand with a grudge and a debt to the livery's owner, but by the time the fire took hold, there had been no proof left to find, only 2 grieving families who needed a name to curse, and his had been the nearest. Marianne, who had spent her whole life believing that worth was rarely where the crowd looked for it, felt something in her steady and resolve. When at last the passes cleared enough to risk the journey, she did not ask Elias to take her onward to Laramie. She asked him to take her home to Cedar Hollow and to stand beside her while she told the town what she had found. It was not a welcome homecoming for either of them. Otis Pruitt, who had profited handsomely from selling the Hale land at a markup within days of taking it, had also, Marianne discovered upon her return, with the help of the old livery owner's widow, a sharp, kind woman named Ruth Calloway, who had never quite believed the story either, been the one holding the hired hand's debt all those years ago, the very debt the fire had conveniently erased along with the evidence of it. When Marianne stood in the church hall with Elias silent but present beside her, and laid out what little proof remained, an old ledger page of Ruth's kept folded in a Bible for 7 years, a debt record with Pruitt's signature, and a name matching the hired hand who'd vanished the night of the fire, the town did not want to hear it. Pruitt was, by then, the man who held half of Cedar Hollow's paper, and plenty of frightened neighbors were inclined to let sleeping ghosts lie rather than risk his temper. It took Ruth Calloway standing at Marianne's side, and the town doctor confirming he'd delivered Marianne's child that very week under Elias's roof, and found the man nothing but gentle and capable, to turn the tide even slightly. Pruitt threatened to call in every loan he held rather than see his name dragged through a 7-year-old fire. And for a few tense weeks, it seemed the town might simply choose its comfortable silence all over again. But Marianne had not survived a blizzard and buried a husband and carried a child through both to be quiet now. She gathered the small proof they had, wrote plainly to the territorial land office about the timing of Pruitt's debt collections, and the conveniently vanished hired hand, and stood, newly delivered of a daughter she named Grace, in the center of the town meeting to say aloud what Elias Boone could not yet bring himself to say for himself, that a man's worth is not decided by whoever shouts loudest about him, and that Cedar Hollow had let its grief make a scapegoat of its gentlest blacksmith, while the true debt and the true guilt walked free wearing a banker's coat. It was Ruth Calloway's ledger page and the territorial marshal's quiet follow-up questions to the hired hand's family 2 counties over that finally unraveled it for good. The hand confessing once cornered that Pruitt had promised to erase his debt if the livery burned before an audit could reveal Pruitt's own mishandling of the town's loan funds. Pruitt left Cedar Hollow before the spring thaw, his notes on half the town's land quietly reassigned to the territorial bank at fair value, and Elias Boone walked back into the town he had fled 7 years before, not as a ghost anymore, but as a man cleared, welcomed first by Ruth Calloway's stubborn insistence and then, slowly, by the rest. He and Mary Ann did not rush toward anything in the months that followed, and we think that restraint is part of what made it real. They built something the way Mary Ann's father had taught her iron was built, slowly, with patience, with attention to what the thing actually needed rather than what haste demanded. Elias reopened the forge that had once been his shame and made it, instead, the place where half the town brought its broken tools and its broken trust to be mended at once. Mary Ann raised Grace in a small house at the edge of town with a garden that, by the second summer, was feeding widows again, the way it always had. And when, eventually, Elias asked her, not with words at first, but by teaching Grace to work the bellows, and by never once, in 2 years, failing to be there when Mary Ann needed him, whether she might consider a life built alongside his, she said yes the way she had said yes to Thomas all those years before, without a backward glance, certain that whatever waited for them, they would meet it together. We began by telling you of a widow, 7 months with child, lost in a blizzard with $12 to her name, and no one left to catch her. We told you a silent man carried her out of that storm and refused to leave her behind, and we promised you a mystery in the shape of his silence. What we did not tell you until now is that the story was never only about the night Mary Ann Hale was saved. It was about a town that had let its grief harden into cruelty, and a man who bore that cruelty for 7 years without a single word of complaint, and a woman whose own losses had taught her exactly how to see worth where others had stopped looking. Mary Ann Hale lost everything on that mountain road and found, in the last place anyone would have thought to look, the one thing worth having, a home built by 2 people who understood, better than most, that survival is only the beginning and that what you do with the life you're given afterward is the real measure of a person. Thank you for spending this time with Mary Ann and with Elias and with all of Cedar Hollow's quiet reckoning. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a little hope tonight. And we'd love to hear your answer to this. Has there ever been a moment when someone's silence toward you turned out to be its own kind of protection? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.